The last patron had left 40 minutes ago, the kitchen staff sent home with generous pay and a promise of silence, and still Percival Ashford sat alone at the corner table, his pale fingers resting beside a glass of wine he would never drink. He didn't check his watch. Time moved differently when you'd lived through centuries, and 3 hours felt like nothing more than a breath held in anticipation. The restaurant Il Tramonto, a small Italian place he'd purchased that morning through a shell company and promptly closed for the evening, glowed with candlelight that cast dancing shadows across the white tablecloth. 2 place settings. 1 chair empty. Percival studied that empty chair with the kind of patient fascination most men reserved for treasures or mysteries, and she was both. The matchmaking agency, an absurdly quaint human invention he'd approached 6 months ago in a moment of what he could only describe as desperate loneliness, had promised discretion and compatibility. What they'd delivered was correspondence that had unraveled something in his chest he'd thought long dead. Letters. Actual handwritten letters, part of the agency's old-fashioned romance package that had made him laugh when he'd signed up. The irony of a 500-year-old vampire seeking old-fashioned anything wasn't lost on him. But those letters had become the fixed point in his existence. Anonymous at first, just 2 strangers sharing thoughts on paper, her handwriting slightly rushed as if she'd stolen moments between obligations to write to him. She was funny, sharp, tired in a way that spoke of someone who'd given too much of herself to a world that rarely gave back. She wrote about small, beautiful things, the way morning light hit her coffee cup, an elderly patient who'd told her jokes during a difficult procedure, the satisfaction of finally getting her landlord to fix the heating. She never complained, but he could read the exhaustion between the lines, the loneliness that mirrored his own. He'd fallen for her through paper and ink, which seemed fitting for someone who'd been born in an era when that was the only way to fall. The agency had finally arranged this meeting 3 weeks ago, providing only first names and a photograph. Vivienne. The picture had shown a woman with dark hair pulled back from a face that looked younger than her 32 years despite the tiredness around her eyes. Pretty, but that wasn't what had made his dead heart clench. It was the guardedness in her expression, the way she smiled for the camera but kept something essential locked away. He'd arrived 2 hours early, unable to help himself, rearranged the flowers, approved the menu he'd never eat, tipped the staff extravagantly before dismissing them. And then he'd sat down to wait, certain with every fiber of his being that she would come. The hour came and went. Then another. Then another. Percival smiled faintly, lifting the wine glass he'd ordered for appearance's sake and studying the deep red liquid in the candlelight. It looked almost like blood, though infinitely less appealing. He'd fed before coming, not wanting to risk any loss of control around her, and now felt the pleasant fullness that made the human world seem soft-edged and manageable. She would come. Perhaps she was working late. She'd mentioned in one letter that she was a nurse, that her schedule was chaos incarnulated. Perhaps she'd gotten stuck in traffic. Perhaps she was nervous, circling the block, gathering courage. He would wait. The restaurant owner, former owner, Percival supposed, since he'd paid 3 times the asking price for immediate transfer, knocked softly on the kitchen door. "Mr. Ashford, sir, it's nearly midnight. Should I—" "You're dismissed with my gratitude," Percival said without turning, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that came from centuries of being obeyed. "Lock up on your way out. I have a key." A pause, then, "Of course, sir. Good evening." The door clicked shut. Silence settled over the restaurant like snow. Percival sat for another 20 minutes, then finally rose with fluid grace that no human could quite manage. He pulled on his coat black wool, impeccably tailored, and retrieved the single white rose he'd brought for her from the bar where he'd left it. He placed it carefully in the center of the empty place setting, a promise in petals. She would come next time. And if there was no next time arranged, he would simply have to arrange it himself. 5 centuries had taught him many things, but the most important was this: anything worth having was worth waiting for, and Vivienne Grace was worth waiting lifetimes. He locked the restaurant behind him and stepped into the November night, the cold that would have made humans huddle deeper into their coats, barely registering against his skin. The city sprawled around him, all glittering lights and human warmth, and somewhere in it, was the woman whose words had reminded him what it felt like to want something beyond mere existence. Percival smiled, white hair catching the streetlight as he walked, and began to plan. Vivienne Grace had been awake for 26 hours straight when she finally collapsed onto her couch, still wearing her scrubs, the fabric stiff with substances she didn't want to think about. Her apartment was dark and cold. The landlord's heating fix had lasted exactly 4 days, and she was too exhausted to care. Her phone sat on the coffee table where she'd thrown it, screen dark, 7 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize. The matchmaking agency, probably. Or him. The man she was supposed to meet 3 nights ago at that restaurant whose name she'd already forced herself to forget. She'd gotten ready. That was the worst part. She'd actually showered, done her hair, put on the one dress she owned that still fit properly. She'd even called a car, watched it pull up outside her building. Felt something dangerous bloom in her chest that felt almost like hope. Then she'd looked at herself in the mirror, really looked and seen someone who'd been left too many times to survive being left again. Her father had left when she was 6. Her mother had died when she was 19, which wasn't the same as leaving but felt like it. Her ex-fiancé had left 2 years ago, taking the ring and the apartment and every last shred of her ability to trust that good things could happen to people like her. The matchmaking agency had been her sister's idea, a birthday present that had felt more like a curse. "You need to get back out there," Veronica had said, as if dating was like exercise, something you just forced yourself to do until it became habit. But then the letters had started. Vivienne rolled onto her side, pulling a throw blanket over herself, and tried not to think about those letters. Tried not to remember the way his words had made her laugh on her worst days, the way he seemed to understand the specific loneliness of caring for people professionally while having no one to care for you. The way he'd described watching the sunset from his apartment and made it sound like poetry. She'd fallen for him through those letters, fallen hard and fast and stupidly, and that was exactly why she couldn't meet him. Because the man in the letters couldn't possibly be real, and even if he was, he wouldn't want the reality of her exhausted, broke, too damaged to be anyone's idea of a romantic partner. Better to be the one who left first for once. Her phone buzzed. Vivienne ignored it, closing her eyes and let exhaustion drag her under. She dreamed of empty chairs and white roses, of words on paper that dissolved into ash the moment she tried to hold them. Percival had been a vampire long enough to be very, very good at finding people who didn't want to be found. He was also, he liked to think, charming enough to make the finding feel less like stalking and more like serendipity. The matchmaking agency had given him her first name, her photograph, and the knowledge that she was a nurse. The rest had taken him exactly 45 minutes of research and one small, persuasive conversation with a night security guard at Mercy General Hospital who'd been happy to confirm that, yes, a Vivienne Grace worked in their ER. He didn't go inside. That felt too invasive, too much like pressure. Instead, he waited across the street at a 24-hour coffee shop with windows that gave him a perfect view of the hospital's employee entrance. He ordered tea he wouldn't drink and settled in to wait, watching the sun rise and set through glass, treated to filter UV rays, one of modernity's small mercies that made daytime movement possible, if uncomfortable. She emerged on the 3rd day at 7 in the morning, looking even more exhausted than her photograph suggested. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, her scrubs rumpled, and she carried the kind of bone-deep tiredness that came from saving lives on no sleep. She was beautiful in the way that art was beautiful. Something about her arrested his attention and wouldn't let go. Percival watched her wait for the tram, watched her slump against the plexiglass shelter, watched her nearly miss the doors opening because she'd closed her eyes for just a moment. He didn't approach. Not yet. This wasn't about cornering her or demanding explanations. This was about understanding who she was beyond the letters, about proving to himself that the woman he'd fallen for on paper was worth the patience he was prepared to give. He followed her home from a distance far enough to be unnoticeable, close enough to ensure she arrived safely. She lived in a converted factory building in a neighborhood that was trying to be trendy but hadn't quite made it, where rent was cheap because nothing quite worked properly. He watched her trudge up 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had an out-of-order sign and felt something protective and fierce settle in his chest. She deserved better. Better apartment, better schedule, better life. Better than being stood up by whatever mediocre human the agency had originally planned to set her up with. Though, of course, she'd been the one to do the standing up, which meant she was running from something, and Percival had centuries of experience with people who ran. Sometimes they needed chasing, sometimes they needed space. The trick was knowing which. He went home to his penthouse apartment, all modern luxury, hiding a collection of artifacts from various centuries, the accumulated wealth of someone who'd had a long time to invest wisely, and sat down at his antique writing desk. The same desk where he'd written every letter to her, the wood smooth under his pale hands. "Dear V," he wrote, using the initial she'd signed her letters with, just as she'd called him P in return. "I hope this letter finds you well, or at least well rested, which I suspect is the greater gift in your profession. I had an interesting experience recently. I waited for someone who never came, and found myself not disappointed but rather intrigued. It made me think about all the reasons people run from things that might be good for them. Fear, usually. Past pain. The very reasonable understanding that hope is dangerous when you've been hurt before. But here's what I've learned in my admittedly long life. Giving up on hope doesn't actually protect you from pain. It just guarantees a different kind of hurt, the slow ache of wondering what might have been. I'm not going anywhere, V. Whatever you're running from, whatever made you decide that isolation was safer than risk, I understand it, and I'm not going anywhere. Take your time. I'll be here. All my best. P. He mailed it through the agency's forwarding system, then sat back and waited. Patience was perhaps his greatest skill, honed through centuries of watching empires rise and fall, of outliving enemies through simple endurance. 3 hours at a restaurant was nothing. He could wait years if necessary, though he rather hoped it wouldn't take years. Vivienne found the letter waiting in her mailbox 4 days later, the agency's distinctive cream envelope standing out among bills and junk mail. Her hands shook as she opened it, standing right there in the building's dingy lobby, and by the time she finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly what she'd done and why, and he wasn't angry. He wasn't even hurt, or if he was, he'd transformed that hurt into understanding so complete it made her chest ache. She read the letter 3 more times sitting on the stairs, then carried it up to her apartment and added it to the box where she kept all his correspondence. 23 letters now, 23 pieces of paper that held more kindness than she'd experienced in years. The worst part was that she'd looked him up after standing him up, guilty and curious in equal measure. Percival Ashford. The name the agency had given her, along with a phone number she'd never called. She'd found almost nothing, no social media, just a few mentions in business journals about philanthropic donations, and a single photograph from a charity gala where he stood in the background, pale and elegant, and so far out of her league they weren't even playing the same sport. Old money, she'd thought. Probably bored, probably slumming it with the matchmaking agency for entertainment. The letters were probably a game to him, except they didn't feel like a game. They felt like someone had looked directly into her soul and decided it was worth treasuring. Vivienne sat at her tiny kitchen table, a folding card table she'd bought at a thrift store, and pulled out the stationery her sister had given her last Christmas. She'd used it for every letter to P, the simple cream paper with her initial embossed at the top. "Dear P," she wrote, then stopped. What could she possibly say? "I'm sorry I stood you up, but I'm too broken to deserve you. I'm falling in love with you through letters, but I'm terrified to meet you in person because reality has never lived up to my hopes." She tried 5 different versions, each one ending in the trash. Finally, exhausted and aching, she wrote the only true thing she could. "I'm scared, and I don't know how to stop being scared, but thank you for understanding. Thank you for not giving up." She mailed it before she could second-guess herself, then went to work and spent 12 hours in the ER, patching up knife wounds and calming down overdose patients and holding the hand of a grandmother who died at 3 a.m. with no family present. This was real, she reminded herself. Pain and death and exhaustion, that was reality. Beautiful letters from kind men were fantasies, and fantasies hurt worse than anything when they inevitably dissolved. But when she got home and collapsed into bed, she dreamed of his words, and for once, the dreams felt gentle. Percival started appearing in her life with the careful orchestration of someone who'd had centuries to perfect the art of the meaningful coincidence. First, it was the coffee shop across from the hospital. She stumbled in after a night shift, barely conscious, and found him sitting by the window with a book. He looked up as if surprised, though he'd been there for 3 hours waiting, and smiled with warm recognition. "V," he said, and his voice was exactly as she'd imagined it, cultured, with an accent she couldn't quite place, holding depth she wanted to explore. She froze, her exhausted brain trying to process that P was here, in her coffee shop, looking like something from a dream, with his white hair and pale skin and eyes that seemed to see straight through her. She started, then stopped, because what could she possibly say? "I thought that might be you," he continued easily, closing his book and standing with unconscious grace. "The agency finally sent a photo along with your last letter. I hope you don't mind my saying hello. I happen to be in the area." A lie, obviously, but a kind lie, one that gave her the option of believing in coincidence if she needed that protection. "How did you," she trailed off, "know you worked here? You mentioned it in one of your letters the time you dealt with that patient who'd swallowed his dentures." He grinned, and it transformed his face from aristocratic to almost boyish. "I remembered because the story made me laugh for hours. You have a gift for finding humor in chaos." Despite herself, despite every defensive wall she'd built, Vivienne felt herself smile. That was a weird Tuesday. "May I buy you coffee? Or breakfast? You look like you've had a long shift." He gestured to the counter, no pressure in the movement, just an offer she could accept or decline. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she'd been running, and it had brought her nothing but loneliness and an apartment so cold she slept in her winter coat. "Coffee," she heard herself say. "Just coffee." His smile widened. "Just coffee is perfect." They sat by the window and talked for 45 minutes, and Vivienne found herself relaxing despite her exhaustion. He was exactly as his letters had suggested, charming without being slick, funny in a dry way that caught her off guard, genuinely interested in what she had to say. He asked about her work and actually listened to the answers, didn't flinch when she described the realities of the ER, seemed to understand the particular exhaustion of caring for people who rarely said thank you. He told her he worked in what he vaguely described as investments and acquisitions, that he'd lived in the city for several years, that he was originally from Eastern Europe, though he'd been traveling most of his life. "I should go," Vivienne finally said, noticing with surprise that the sun had fully risen. "I need to sleep before my next shift." "Of course." Percival stood when she did, that old-fashioned courtesy that should have seemed affected, but somehow just seemed natural on him. "May I see you again? Intentionally this time, not by accident?" She should say no. Every piece of hard-won wisdom told her to protect herself. "Maybe," she said instead. "Let me think about it." "Take all the time you need." He pulled a card from his pocket, cream-colored, expensive, with just his name and a phone number embossed in gold. "Call me when you're ready, or don't call, and I'll simply enjoy the letters we already share." She took the card, their fingers brushing for just a moment. His skin was cool, and something about the touch sent electricity down her spine. "Thank you for the coffee," she managed. "Thank you for the company." He held the door open for her, and she walked out into the morning, feeling off balance and strangely hopeful in a way that terrified her. It took her 3 days to call him. They met for dinner at a small Thai place she loved, nothing fancy, and Percival charmed the staff in what Vivienne was beginning to recognize as his default mode of operation. He had a way of making everyone feel seen and valued, of finding the exact right thing to say to make people smile. "Do you ever turn it off?" she asked halfway through the meal, gesturing with her fork at the way their waitress had practically glowed when he'd complimented her recommendation. "Turn what off?" "The charm. You're very—" she searched for the word. "Smooth, like you've had years of practice being exactly what people need you to be." Something flickered in his expression, there and gone too fast to read. "Would you prefer me to be rude?" "I'd prefer you to be real." He set down his fork. He'd been pushing food around his plate more than eating, she noticed, and looked at her directly. "I'm terrified," he said simply. "That's real enough for you? I've been alone for a very long time, and then I met you through paper and ink and realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to want to be known by someone. Then you didn't show up to our date, and instead of being angry, I just thought, of course. Of course someone that wonderful would be too smart to want someone like me. Vivienne's breath caught. Someone like you? You're perfect. Perfect apartment, perfect manners, perfect face. I'm really not. His smile was crooked, self-deprecating. I'm old-fashioned to the point of ridiculous. I work too much. I have control issues that would probably drive you crazy, and I'm far too intense about things that matter to me. But I'm trying to be real with you, V. I'm trying to show you who I actually am beneath the charm, as you call it. Someone who waited 3 hours at a restaurant because I was too hopeful to believe you wouldn't come. Someone who would wait 300 hours if that's what it took. Why? The word came out barely above a whisper. Because you write about morning light on coffee cups and make me remember why beautiful things matter. Because you're kind in a world that punishes kindness. Because I've read your letters 50 times each, and I fall a little more in love with who you are every time. He reached across the table, stopping just short of touching her hand. Because you're worth waiting for, Vivienne Grace, and I'm a patient man. She should pull away, should recognize this as love bombing or manipulation, or any of the red flags her therapist had taught her to watch for. But his hand was steady on the table, an offer, not a demand, and his eyes held nothing but open honesty. Vivienne put her hand in his, felt that same electric coolness, and let herself take the risk. I'm not good at this, she said, at trusting people, at believing good things can last. Then we'll take it slow, Percival said, as slow as you need. I'm not going anywhere. They finished dinner, talking about everything and nothing books they had read, places they wanted to travel, the weird politics of hospital administration versus his vague descriptions of business negotiations. He paid despite her protests, and when he walked her to the tram stop, he didn't try to kiss her. Just held her hand and told her he'd love to see her again whenever she was ready. Vivienne rode home feeling lighter than she had in years, and if a small voice in her head warned that this was too good to be true, she told it firmly to shut up and let her have this. The letters continued, but now they were supplemented by text messages and phone calls and careful, gradual dates that Percival seemed to orchestrate around her chaotic schedule. Coffee before her shifts, late dinners after, a visit to an art museum on her rare day off where he knew surprising amounts about Renaissance painting. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give, never pressured her to come to his apartment or invite him to hers, seemed content to build something slowly, brick by careful brick, until Vivienne realized one day that she was in love with him and had been for months. The realization terrified her so much she ghosted him for a week. Percival, predictably, didn't respond with anger. Instead, she came home from a particularly brutal shift to find a package outside her door. Inside was a soft cashmere blanket in deep blue, the kind of luxury she'd never bought for herself, and a note in his familiar handwriting, for the cold nights. I remember you mentioned your heating was inconsistent, no strings attached, no expectations, just wanted you to be warm. She wrapped herself in the blanket and cried, then picked up her phone. I'm sorry, she said when he answered. I got scared. I know. His voice was gentle. Do you want to talk about it? Not really. Maybe, I don't know. She pulled the blanket tighter. Thank you for the gift, it's beautiful. You're welcome, Vivienne. I need you to understand something. He paused, and she could almost see him choosing his words carefully. I know you've been hurt. I know you're waiting for me to leave or change or reveal myself to be someone different than who I've shown you. But I'm not going anywhere. Even when you run, especially when you run, I'll be here when you're ready to come back. Why? She asked again, because she still didn't understand. Because you're you. Because I've lived a long time and met countless people, and none of them have made me feel the way you do. Because I think we could be extraordinary together if you'd let us try. He took a breath. And because I'm in love with you, and I'm too old and stubborn to pretend otherwise. Vivienne closed her eyes, fear and hope warring in her chest. I'm in love with you too, she whispered. That's why I'm so scared. Then be scared with me instead of alone, Percival said. Let me in, V. Let me prove that I'm worth the risk. She thought about all the times people had left. Her father's empty promises, her mother's death, her ex-fiancé's casual cruelty. Then she thought about the last 6 months of letters and coffee dates and patient kindness of a man who'd waited 3 hours for her and never once made her feel guilty for not showing up. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'm going to try." She could hear his smile through the phone. "That's all I ask." They started spending more time together after that, and Vivienne slowly began to notice the small oddities she'd overlooked in her fog of cautious feelings. The way Percival never ate when they went out, just pushed food around his plate while asking her about her day. The way he flinched from bright sunlight, always suggesting evening dates or indoor activities. The old-fashioned way he spoke sometimes, as if English wasn't quite his first language despite his perfect fluency. The way his skin was always cool to the touch, even in warm rooms. She didn't think much of it until she visited his apartment for the first time and found herself in what could only be described as a museum of history. Artifacts from different eras displayed casually on shelves, a Roman coin, what looked like a medieval sword, paintings that seemed far too valuable to be originals but probably were, books in languages she didn't recognize, and everywhere, heavy curtains blocking every window, the kind of darkness that felt intentional. "You collect old things," she said, studying a tapestry that looked centuries old. "I appreciate history." Percival handed her a glass of wine, keeping one for himself, though she'd noticed he never drank. "Things that last, that survive. There's value in endurance." "How old is this?" She gestured to the tapestry. 15th century, Flemish. I acquired it from an estate sale some time ago." He said it casually, but something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. "You're different here," she observed. "More yourself, maybe? Less careful. Is that bad?" "No, I like it." She set down her wine and moved closer to him, studying his face in the dim lighting. "You're very pale. I noticed before, but here it's more obvious." "Northern European heritage," he said smoothly. "We don't tan well." "And the white hair? You can't be more than 35. 37, but thank you." His smile was amused. "Early gray runs in the family. I decided to embrace it rather than dye it." The explanations were reasonable, but something niggled at her. She thought about the way he'd mentioned living a long time, about his extensive historical knowledge, about the portrait on his wall that looked like it could be from the 18th century and featured a man who looked remarkably like him. "Percival," she said slowly, "what exactly do you do for work?" "I told you, investments." "No, really, what do you do?" She pulled back to look at him directly. "And don't give me the vague answer you give everyone else. Give me the real one." He was quiet for a long moment, something like calculation crossing his face. Then he seemed to come to a decision. "I manage assets accumulated over a very long period of time," he said carefully. "I invest in ventures that interest me, donate to causes I support, and generally try to use resources I've had significant time to accumulate for purposes beyond mere wealth." "How long is a very long period?" Another pause. "Vivienne, if I told you something that seemed impossible, would you listen with an open mind?" Her heart started beating faster. "That depends on what the impossible thing is." He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly to reveal the night sky over the city. "Do you believe in things that exist outside normal human experience, in legends that might have roots in reality?" "Are you about to tell me you're secretly a werewolf?" she joked, trying to lighten the sudden tension. "Not a werewolf, no." He turned to face her, and his expression was utterly serious. "Vivienne, I'm going to be honest with you because you deserve honesty, and because I can't build something real with you on a foundation of lies. But I need you to listen to the whole explanation before you decide I'm insane." "Okay," she said slowly, fear creeping in. This was it, the moment where he revealed the truth that would ruin everything. Secret wife, criminal past, whatever it was that made him too good to be true. "I'm a vampire," Percival said simply. "I was turned in 1523, which makes me just over 500 years old. I drink blood to survive, I can't tolerate direct sunlight, and I've spent the last 5 centuries watching the world change while I remain essentially unchanged." Vivienne stared at him. Then she laughed, because obviously this was a joke. "Right. And I'm secretly a fairy princess." "I'm completely serious." He didn't smile. "I know how it sounds. I know every instinct you have is telling you this is ridiculous. But it's the truth, and if we're going to continue this relationship, you need to know who and what I am." The laughter died in her throat. He wasn't joking. His face held nothing but earnest honesty, and suddenly all the small oddities clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The pale skin and white hair, the never eating, the historical artifacts owned, not collected, the way he'd said he'd been alone for a very long time. "You're serious," she whispered. "Yes." "You think you're a vampire?" "I don't think, I know." He moved toward her slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. "I can prove it if you need me to, though I'd rather not frighten you. The last thing I want is for you to be afraid of me." Vivienne's mind raced. This was insane. Vampires weren't real. They were fiction, stories, Halloween costumes, except she worked in an ER and had seen enough inexplicable things to know that reality was stranger than most people admitted. And Percival was looking at her with such vulnerable honesty that she couldn't quite dismiss it. "Prove it," she heard herself say. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering courage, then opened them. His irises had changed from their normal dark blue to something that glowed faintly red, and when he opened his mouth, she saw fangs, actual fangs, where his canines should be. Vivienne stumbled backward, her brain struggling to process what she was seeing. "Oh my God!" "I'm sorry." His voice was pained, and even through her shock, she noticed he kept his distance. "I should have told you sooner. I didn't want to lose you before you knew me well enough to understand I would never hurt you. You're a vampire." She said it out loud, testing the words. "An actual vampire. That's why you don't eat, why you avoid sunlight, why you have a tapestry from the 15th century that you probably bought new." "Technically, I won it in a card game in 1501, he said, then winced. "Sorry, poor time for levity." She was shaking, but as the initial shock faded, she realized she wasn't afraid. Disoriented, yes. Confused, absolutely. But Percival hadn't moved toward her, hadn't tried to use whatever supernatural abilities he had to influence her. He just stood there looking miserable and hopeful in equal measure, waiting for her to process. Do you drink human blood?" she asked. "Yes, but never without consent. I have arrangements with people who donate willingly in exchange for payment. No one is hurt, no one is turned without explicit agreement. I follow very strict ethical guidelines." He spoke quickly, as if trying to get the information out before she could panic further. "The blood drinking is survival, not violence. I don't kill, I don't hunt, I don't do any of the horrific things from movies." "But you could." "Technically, yes. The same way you could technically stab someone with a scalpel. Capability isn't the same as intention." He ran a hand through his white hair. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you probably want to leave and never see me again, and I'll respect that if that's your choice. But please believe that everything else I've told you is true. My feelings for you, my intentions, the person I've been with you, that's all real. This is just additional context." Vivienne sank onto his couch, her legs suddenly unsteady. A vampire. She'd fallen in love with a vampire. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was actually kind of fitting in a weird way. Of course, the first person she'd let herself care about in years would turn out to be immortal. Of course, the universe would give her something this complicated. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." Percival grabbed his phone and pulled up a car service app. "I'm calling you a car. I'll pay for it. Please just let me know when you've processed this. Even if the answer is that you never want to see me again, I need to know you're all right." The car arrived quickly, and Vivienne left without looking back, her mind spinning with impossible truths. She didn't call him for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, Vivienne did what she did best: research. Medical journals, historical records, mythology texts checked out from the library. She interviewed the hospital's oldest doctor about unusual cases he'd seen. She even, in a moment of desperation, visited a psychic shop and asked about vampires, though the teenager behind the counter had just recommended some books and sold her a crystal. Everything she found suggested that vampires, if they existed, were rare and extraordinarily good at hiding. There were legends from every culture, medical conditions that might explain some symptoms, but nothing concrete. Nothing that proved or disproved what Percival had told her. The letters kept coming. One every 3 days, like clockwork, forwarded through the agency. He didn't mention being a vampire in them, just wrote about his days, asked about hers, told her he missed her and was here whenever she was ready to talk. The patience of the letters felt even more significant now. 500 years of life, and he was spending his time waiting for her to process, never pressuring, never demanding, just present. On day 15, Vivienne had a patient come into the ER with a knife wound that should have been fatal. The young man had lost liters of blood, his pressure was crashing, and they were out of his blood type. She watched him start to code, watched the life leave his eyes, and thought about all the impossible things that happened in medicine. People who survived things they shouldn't, spontaneous remissions, unexplained recoveries. Reality was stranger than most people admitted. She left the hospital at 7 a.m. and went directly to the coffee shop where she'd first seen Percival in person. He was there, sitting in the same seat by the window with a book, as if he'd been waiting every morning for her to show up. Maybe he had been. He looked up as she entered, and the hope that flashed across his face made her chest ache. "Hi," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Hi?" His voice was careful, controlled. "How are you?" "Exhausted, confused, possibly insane." She studied his face, the pale, perfect features that she now understood would never age, never change. "But I missed you." "I missed you too." He set down his book. Did you come to a decision?" "I have questions first." "Anything. Can you turn me into a vampire?" He blinked, clearly not expecting that. "Yes, technically, though it's not something I would ever do lightly or without extensive discussion." "Why?" "Because I needed to know if you've been planning this, if the whole relationship was about finding someone to turn, to keep you company for eternity or whatever." "No." The answer was immediate and firm. "Vivienne, I approached the matchmaking agency because I was lonely and wanted connection, not because I was recruiting. If we stay together for the next 60 years and you never become a vampire, I'll cherish every moment we have and grieve when you're gone. Your humanity isn't something I want to change." She nodded slowly. "Okay. Next question. Are there more of you? Is there like a vampire government or society I need to worry about?" "Yes, there's a structured vampire society. We call it the court. He hesitated. "I'm the king of our region, the Eastern American court. It's more administrative than it sounds, mostly maintaining order and mediating disputes. But it means I have responsibilities to my people, obligations I can't ignore." "You're a king." Of course he was. Of course the vampire she fell in love with would be royalty. "Is that dangerous? Will other vampires come after me to get to you?" "I would never let anyone hurt you," he said with such absolute conviction that she believed him. "But yes, there are political complexities. Vampires who might see a human connection as weakness, which is part of why I wanted to be honest with you. I need you to be able to protect yourself, to know what you're getting into." Vivienne absorbed that. "Last question. Do you love me? Really love me, not because of some vampire magic or because I smell delicious or whatever?" "I love you." Percival reached across the table, waiting for her to take his hand. "I love your strength and your kindness and the way you find humor in darkness. I love that you write about morning light and actually notice beautiful things in the middle of chaos. I love your stubbornness and your fear and your willingness to take risks despite being terrified. I love you as a person, Vivienne Grace, and I would love you if you were human or vampire or anything else." She took his hand, felt that familiar cool touch, and made her decision. "Okay. Okay? I'm in. I'm terrified, and this is completely insane, but I'm in." She squeezed his fingers. "Because I love you too, and I've spent too much of my life running from things that scare me. You waited 3 hours at a restaurant for me. The least I can do is take a chance on us." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, brilliant and warm despite the literal coolness of his skin. "You have no idea how happy that makes me. Probably pretty happy, given the whole waiting every morning at this coffee shop thing. I would have waited every morning for the rest of your life if that's what it took," he said simply. They sat there holding hands across the table, and Vivienne felt something settle in her chest. Fear, yes. Uncertainty, absolutely. But also hope, real and solid and worth fighting for. "So what now?" she asked. "Now I take you to breakfast somewhere that actually serves food you'll eat, and we talk about what a relationship between a human and a vampire actually looks like." Percival stood, pulling her to her feet. "And then, if you're willing, I'd very much like to take you on a proper date, maybe even back to that Italian restaurant where you first stood me up." Despite everything, Vivienne laughed. "You're never going to let me forget that, are you?" "Absolutely not. It's a core part of our romantic story. I'll be telling our grandchildren about the time their grandmother stood me up." He paused. "Metaphorical grandchildren, unless you decide otherwise somewhere down the line." "One impossible thing at a time," she said, but she was smiling. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, and his lips were cool, but the emotion behind the kiss was warm enough to melt every last defense she'd built. The next few months were a strange, wonderful adjustment period of learning to love someone who existed outside normal human parameters. Vivienne met other vampires Percival's court, a collection of immortals with varying degrees of friendliness toward humans. Some were welcoming, others were coldly polite in a way that made her nervous. "They'll warm up to you," Percival assured her after a particularly tense dinner with his second-in-command, a severe vampire woman named Katerina, who'd spent the entire evening looking at Vivienne like she was a temporary inconvenience. "They're just protective. We've had issues with humans learning about us and causing problems." "I'm not going to cause problems." "I know that. You know that. They'll figure it out eventually." He pulled her closer on the couch in his apartment. Their apartment, really, since she'd been spending more nights here than at her own place. "Besides, I'm the king. If I say you're part of the court, you're part of the court. Pulling rank on your own people seems like bad leadership. Pulling rank to protect the woman I love seems like excellent priorities." He kissed her temple. "Stop worrying about them and tell me about your day. Did the kid with the Lego up his nose make it out okay?" She laughed and launched into the story, and the normalcy of it, the casual domesticity of sharing their days, made her forget sometimes that she was dating a 500-year-old vampire king. Until the night someone tried to kill her. She was leaving the hospital after a late shift when a figure stepped out of the shadows of the parking garage. Vampires, she'd learned to recognize them by now, by the otherworldly grace and the predatory stillness. This one was young-looking, maybe turned in his 20s, with the kind of angry desperation in his eyes that Vivienne recognized from her patients. "You're the king's human," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'm Vivienne," she corrected, hand sliding toward the panic button on her keychain that Percival had insisted she carry. "Can I help you with something?" "You can stop weakening him. Stop making him soft." The vampire moved closer, faster than she could track. "We have enemies, real threats, and he's playing house with a mortal who'll be dead in a blink. That seems like something you should take up with him, not me." She pressed the panic button, hoping Percival or one of his people was close enough to respond. "I'm taking it up with the problem." He lunged, and Vivienne had just enough time to think this is it before another figure slammed into her attacker with enough force to crack the concrete pillar behind them. Percival. He'd arrived in seconds, moving with inhuman speed, and the fury on his face was terrifying. He had the other vampire pinned against the pillar, one hand around his throat, and his voice when he spoke was nothing like the gentle tone he used with her. "You touch her again, and I will end you so thoroughly there won't be enough left for the court to judge. Do you understand me, Marcus?" The young vampire gurgled something that might have been assent. "Good. Now you're going to go directly to Katerina, confess what you attempted, and accept whatever punishment the court deems appropriate. If you run, I will hunt you. If you return, I will destroy you. Clear?" Another gurgle. Percival released him, and Marcus fled with supernatural speed. Then Percival turned to Vivienne, and the fury melted into concern so profound it made her heart clench. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? I swear to you, I will make sure this never happens again." "I'm fine." She was shaking, but unhurt. "You got here in time. I should have been here sooner. I should have anticipated this, should have assigned you protection." He was spiraling, she realized, guilt and fear overriding his usual composure. "Hey, She put her hands on his face, making him look at her. I'm okay. You saved me. We're okay. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he said quietly. That loving me would put you in danger. And this is exactly what I signed up for when I said yes to this relationship. Vivienne pulled him closer. I'm not going to run just because one angry vampire has issues with your dating choices, but we do need to figure out better security. He laughed shakily. You're remarkable. Anyone else would be demanding I turn them or leave them or something rational. I'm an ER nurse. I don't scare easy. She kissed him softly, though I wouldn't say no to some self-defense training. Maybe learn how to throw a punch that would actually hurt a vampire. I'll have Katerina teach you. She'll appreciate the practicality. Percival held her close, and she felt him shaking slightly. I love you. I need you to know that. I love you more than I've loved anyone in 5 centuries, and the thought of losing you. You're not going to lose me, Vivienne promised. I'm too stubborn to die, and too in love with you to let some political drama scare me off. They stood in the parking garage, holding each other, until Vivienne's shaking stopped, and then Percival drove her home and didn't leave her side for the next 3 days. Marcus was exiled from the court. Katerina, surprisingly, sought Vivienne out afterward to offer a stiff apology for not anticipating the threat and to schedule those self-defense lessons. By the end of the first session, during which Vivienne managed to land exactly 1 successful hit on the vampire woman and earned a rare smile of approval, they developed a tentative mutual respect. You're tougher than you look, Katerina observed, handing Vivienne a water bottle. Thanks, I think. It's a compliment. The king chose well. You won't break easily. She paused. That matters in our world. Humans who date vampires usually either break or become obsessed with turning. You seem to be doing neither. I'm just taking it one day at a time. Vivienne drank deeply, her muscles aching from the workout. Though I admit the idea of turning is complicated. I see death every day in my work. The idea of not aging, not dying, it's appealing and terrifying in equal measure. If you ever decide you want it, make sure it's for yourself, not for him, Katerina said seriously. Eternity is too long to live for someone else's sake. It was good advice, and Vivienne tucked it away to think about later. Life settled into a new rhythm. Work at the hospital, time with Percival, training with Katerina, occasional dinners with the court where Vivienne slowly won over various vampires through sheer persistent friendliness and an ability to keep up with centuries-old gossip. She moved into Percival's apartment officially, giving up her freezing studio with relief. Her sister Veronica was delighted that the matchmaking agency had worked out, though Vivienne had to carefully edit out the vampire aspects of the relationship. He's wonderful, Veronica kept saying. So polite, so attentive, and rich. You did good, V. Vivienne just smiled and agreed, because, yeah, she had done good, better than she'd ever imagined. 8 months into their relationship, Percival took her back to Il Tramonto. He'd bought the restaurant permanently this time, remodeled it into something elegant and intimate, and when Vivienne walked in, she found it empty except for a single table set for 2 with candles and white roses. This is where it started, Percival said, pulling out her chair. Where I waited for you and believed you'd come even when you didn't. I remember. Vivienne sat, her heart beating faster. I was so scared that night, scared that you'd be disappointed when you met me in person, scared that I'd fall for you and you'd leave like everyone else. And now? Now I'm still scared sometimes, but I'm more afraid of losing what we have than of taking the risk. She looked around the restaurant, remembering the story he'd told her about waiting here alone. I'm sorry I didn't come that night. I'm not. Percival sat across from her, taking her hand. If you'd come, you would have been forcing yourself past your fear, not choosing me because you were ready. The fact that you came back later on your own terms that meant everything. A waiter appeared, one of Percival's people. Vivienne recognized and placed covered dishes before them. When he lifted the lids, she found her favorite pasta dish, the same one she'd mentioned loving in one of her early letters. You remember, she said softly. I remember everything you've ever told me. He picked up his wine glass, the gesture automatic even though he wouldn't drink. Vivienne, I asked you here tonight because I have a question to ask you. Her breath caught. Okay. I know we've talked about the future in abstract terms, about the complications of a human-vampire relationship, about the choice you might face someday, about turning, about all the practical concerns. He set down the glass and pulled a small box from his pocket. But none of those concerns matter as much as this. I love you. I want to spend whatever time we have, whether that's the next 60 years or the next 600, building a life with you. So I'm asking, will you marry me? He opened the box to reveal a ring that was somehow both antique and modern, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight. Vivienne's eyes filled with tears. A year ago, she wouldn't have believed this moment was possible. She'd been too afraid, too damaged, too convinced that good things didn't happen to people like her. But Percival had waited, had been patient, had proven through consistent action that he wasn't going anywhere. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then he was around the table, pulling her to her feet, kissing her with 500 years of emotion behind it. I love you, he whispered against her lips. I will love you until the end of time itself. I love you too. She kissed him again, tasting salt from her own tears. My ridiculous, patient, wonderful vampire king. They spent the rest of the evening at that table, talking about the future, the wedding they'd plan, the life they'd build, the 1,000 small decisions that made up a relationship. Percival mentioned wanting to step back from some of his court responsibilities, to have more time for them. Vivienne talked about maybe cutting her hours at the hospital, finding a better balance. I've been thinking about the turning thing, she said carefully as they shared dessert she ate while he watched with fond amusement. Not now, but maybe someday, when I've lived enough of a human life to feel ready for something different. We have time to decide, Percival said. No rush. Whatever you choose, I'll be here. I know. And she did know, absolutely and completely. That's why I can actually think about it, because you've never pressured me, never made it feel like a requirement. You've just waited for me to be ready. I'm very good at waiting. His smile was soft. I waited 3 hours at a restaurant. I waited weeks for you to call. I waited 500 years to find you. I can wait as long as you need. They went home to their apartment and made love slowly, carefully, Vivienne getting used to the coolness of his skin against hers, the supernatural strength he kept carefully controlled. Afterward, lying tangled together in the dark, she felt more at peace than she'd ever been. The wedding was small, held at sunset in a garden that Percival rented for the occasion. Vivienne's sister served as maid of honor, and Katerina stood up for Percival, which surprised everyone, including Katerina herself. The vampire court attended, along with Vivienne's hospital friends, who thought they were at a normal wedding and had no idea half the guests didn't have heartbeats. I can't believe you pulled this off without anyone noticing, Vivienne whispered as they swayed on the dance floor. The sun finally set enough that Percival could fully relax. Centuries of practice hiding in plain sight. He spun her gently. Though I admit it's strange having a celebration during my traditional waking hours. Usually vampire events are much later. We can have a second reception later tonight for your people, she offered. Make it a full vampire party. Look at you, already thinking about court politics. He kissed her forehead. You're going to make an excellent queen. I'm not a queen. I'm just your wife. You're my wife and my queen and the love of my very long life, Percival corrected. All of the above. They honeymooned in Europe, where Percival showed her places he'd lived centuries ago, told her stories about historical events he'd witnessed, introduced her to vampires so old they remembered when Rome fell. It was surreal and wonderful and occasionally terrifying, but Vivienne found herself adapting. She was good at adapting. Nursing had taught her that. 3 years into their marriage, Vivienne made the decision to turn, not because she was afraid of aging or dying, but because she wanted more time with Percival, more time to see the world, more time to experience everything she'd missed while being too afraid to live. Are you absolutely certain? Percival asked for the 100th time as they sat in their bedroom, the turning ritual prepared. Once we do this, there's no going back. I'm certain. Vivienne took his hand. I've lived 35 human years. I've saved lives. I've loved. I've experienced enough to know who I am. Now I want to see what comes next. With you. The turning was painful, but not unbearable, And when Vivienne woke 3 days later with enhanced senses and a craving for blood, Percival was there holding her hand. "Welcome to eternity," he said softly. "How do you feel?" She considered the question, taking inventory of her new reality. Sharper sight, enhanced hearing, strength she could feel humming under her skin. The world looked different, smelled different, felt different in ways she was still processing. "Hungry," she admitted, "and scared, and excited, and really, really glad you're here." "I'll always be here." He helped her sit up carefully. "Now, let's get you fed and then we'll start teaching you how to control your new abilities. Katerina's already volunteered to help with training." Learning to be a vampire was harder than Vivienne expected. The strength took getting used to. She broke 3 coffee cups in the first week alone. The blood drinking was strange, but not as horrific as she'd feared. Percival had ethical sources arranged, and the act itself became just another part of existence. The hardest part was faking humanity when she went back to work, remembering to breathe and blink and move at human speed. But she adapted. She always did. 5 years after turning, Vivienne and Percival were having dinner. Well, she was having dinner. He was keeping her company at a small diner they'd discovered near the hospital. It had become their regular spot, the place they went when they wanted to feel normal and human and connected to the ordinary world. "Table for the usual?" the waitress, an older woman named Gloria, asked with a warm smile. "Please," Vivienne said, and they settled into their regular booth. This had become their ritual. Once a week they came here, and Vivienne ordered food she could still eat if she was careful, and they talked about everything and nothing. Court politics and hospital gossip, current events and historical comparisons, dreams and plans and silly observations about the people around them. "I was thinking," Percival said as Vivienne worked on a burger she could actually digest now that she'd learned the trick of metabolizing human food occasionally. "About that restaurant, Il Tramonto." "What about it?" "I think we should sell it, or turn it into something else." He played with his coffee cup decaf that he wouldn't drink but ordered anyway. "It served its purpose. It's where our story started, but we don't need to hold on to it anymore." "Because we have this place now," Vivienne said, understanding. Il Tramonto was beautiful and elegant and romantic, but this diner was real. It was where they came to be themselves, where the staff knew them as regulars, where they could laugh and argue and exist without pretense. "Exactly. This is where we built our life. Not in grand gestures, but in weekly dinners and terrible coffee and Gloria's judgment about my never eating." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I don't need monuments to how we started. I just need you, and terrible diner coffee, and a future we're building one ordinary day at a time." Vivienne squeezed his fingers, her enhanced strength carefully controlled. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm 523 years old and married to the woman I waited 3 hours in a restaurant for. I'm allowed to be sentimental." "Fair point." She took another bite of her burger, savoring the taste, even though she didn't technically need food anymore. "So what do we do with all this eternity we have now?" "Whatever you want. Travel, work, laze around reading for decades, start a foundation, adopt a pet dragon." "Dragons aren't real," she laughed. "Says the vampire to the vampire about mythical creatures." His eyes danced with amusement. "My point is, we have time. No rush. We can figure it out as we go." And they did. Years passed, decades, eventually, and Vivienne and Percival built a life that was extraordinary in its ordinariness. They traveled extensively, seeing corners of the world Vivienne had only dreamed about. She eventually left nursing, the toll of pretending to age out of her position becoming too complicated, and instead started a foundation that provided health care to underserved communities. Percival stepped back from active leadership of the court, appointing Katerina as Queen Regent, while he maintained an advisory role. He'd spent enough centuries ruling, he said. Now he wanted to live. They fought sometimes, the way all couples did. Vivienne's stubborn independence clashed with Percival's protective instincts. His tendency to make decisions without consulting her frustrated her systematic approach to problem-solving. But they always talked through it, always remembered that they'd chosen each other through every obstacle, and the fights never lasted long. 50 years after their wedding, the court requested their presence at a formal celebration honoring Percival's centuries of service. Vivienne wore a gown that would have cost more than her entire nursing salary for a year and stood beside her husband as various ancient vampires gave speeches about his wisdom and leadership. "This is excruciating," she whispered to him during a particularly long-winded tribute. "Welcome to vampire politics. This is why I retired." He kept his expression appropriately solemn despite his amusement. "How much longer?" "Hours, probably. Maybe decades. Vampire ceremonies tend to run long." She pinched his side gently, since vampire strength made even affectionate gestures dangerous. "You're the worst. You married me anyway." "Biggest mistake of my immortal life," she said, but she was grinning. When they finally returned home in the early morning hours, both of them exhausted from maintaining court appearances, they collapsed onto their couch in comfortable silence. "Do you ever regret it?" Percival asked quietly. "Turning? Choosing this life?" "Never." Vivienne didn't have to think about it. "I get to wake up next to you every day. I get to see the world change, to keep learning and growing, to have adventures I never dreamed possible. Why would I regret that? Some people find immortality lonely." "Good thing I have you then." She curled into his side, fitting perfectly after decades of practice. "Though, I admit, I do miss coffee sometimes, real coffee that I could actually drink properly. We can work on that. Maybe in another century or two, someone will invent synthetic coffee that vampires can metabolize. Or we could just enjoy the terrible diner coffee by smell alone." She closed her eyes, content. "It's enough." And it was. More than enough. Vivienne had spent the first 35 years of her life being too afraid to hope for good things. And then she'd met a vampire who waited 3 hours at a restaurant believing she'd come, who never gave up on her, even when she gave up on herself, who proved that patience and faith and stubborn love could transform everything. 100 years after that first missed date, Vivienne and Percival were still going to diners and holding hands and building a life one ordinary day at a time. They'd had adventures traveled to 6 continents, started 3 foundations, helped broker peace between rival vampire courts, rescued a whale once, though that was more accident than design, but their favorite moments were always the quiet ones. "Do you remember the letters?" Vivienne asked one evening as they walked through the city, the modern world transformed beyond recognition from when they'd met, but somehow still familiar in its essential humanity. "Every word," Percival said. "I still have them all, you know, in a safe deposit box." "So do I." She leaned into him, comfortable in the way only decades of partnership could create. "I fell in love with you through those letters. Before I knew what you looked like, before I knew what you were, before I knew anything except that you saw me. You saw me too. The real me, not the king or the vampire or the accumulated centuries, just me." He stopped walking, turning to face her under a streetlight. "That's the thing about loving you, Vivienne. You've never been impressed by the immortality or the power or any of it. You just love me. Well, you're very lovable when you're not being overprotective and dramatic. I prefer the term appropriately cautious and emotionally expressive." She laughed, the sound bright in the night air, and kissed him there on the sidewalk while humans passed by, unaware that they were witnessing a love story that had lasted over a century and would last countless centuries more. They had eternity, and they planned to use every moment of it. Years continued to flow by like water, and Vivienne and Percival settled into the kind of deep, abiding partnership that came from choosing each other repeatedly through every challenge. They'd faced court politics and human complications, dangers both supernatural and mundane, moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But they always came back to the same truth: they were better together than apart. Eventually, they made the decision to have a child. It was complicated. Vampire reproduction required ancient magic and careful timing, but after extensive consultation with the oldest vampires in the court and months of preparation, Vivienne became pregnant with a son they named Casimir. Holding him for the first time, this impossible child who was born to 2 vampires but grew faster than human children, Vivienne understood what Percival had meant about hope being dangerous but necessary. "He's perfect," she whispered, counting tiny fingers. "He has your stubbornness already," Percival said, watching their son grip his finger with surprising strength. "And my timing for dramatic entrances. We're in trouble." "The best kind of trouble," She looked up at her husband, this vampire king who'd waited for her across time itself. Thank you. For what? For not giving up on me. For waiting. For proving that good things can last. Percival leaned down to kiss her forehead, careful not to disturb their sleeping son. Thank you for finally showing up, he said softly. To the restaurant, to our life, to this future we're building. It's everything I waited for and more. Casimir grew quickly, developing the enhanced abilities of vampire children along with a personality that was equal parts his parents' best and worst traits. Stubborn like his mother, charming like his father, protective of both, and absolutely determined to find his own path. He's going to be trouble, Katerina observed when Casimir was 10 and had just accidentally destroyed a training room showing off for his friends. He's perfect, Vivienne countered, though she was already calculating the cost of repairs. He's both, Percival said diplomatically, just like his mother. Vivienne threw a pillow at him, which he caught easily, and their son laughed from the doorway. This was their life now. Chaos and love and the daily work of raising a child who was neither fully vampire nor human, but something beautifully in between. They made mistakes, figured things out as they went, and somehow managed to build a family that was strange and wonderful and theirs. On their 200th wedding anniversary, Percival took Vivienne back to Il Tramonto. He'd kept it after all, unable to fully let go of the place that started everything. They sat at the same table where he'd waited 3 hours, where the empty chair had held so much promise. No empty chairs this time, Vivienne observed. No empty chairs, Percival agreed. Just you and me and 200 years of choosing each other. Best decision I ever made. She raised her glass of wine she still couldn't quite drink, but kept for the ritual of it. To the next 200 years? To eternity, Percival corrected, clinking his glass against hers. However long that turns out to be, I want to spend it with you. Deal. She smiled at him across the table, this man who'd been patient enough to wait for her, who'd never given up even when she'd given up on herself. Though I reserve the right to stand you up occasionally just to keep things interesting. As long as you eventually show up, I'll wait as long as it takes. And he meant it, she knew. He would wait lifetimes, centuries, eons if necessary. That was who he was, patient and stubborn and relentlessly hopeful in a way that had changed her entire existence. They finished their anniversary dinner and went home to their family, to their son who was growing too fast, to their life that was messy and complicated and absolutely perfect. Somewhere in the city, in a small diner that was still their favorite spot, Gloria the waitress was probably wondering why they hadn't come in this week. They'd go tomorrow, Vivienne decided, back to the ordinary place where they felt most themselves, where being vampire royalty mattered less than being regulars who tipped well and laughed too loud. Because that was the thing about immortality, she had learned. It wasn't about grand gestures or epic romances or living in castles and wearing crowns. It was about finding someone who saw you completely and chose you anyway. It was about building a life one ordinary day at a time, through diner coffee and self-defense lessons and arguments about whose turn it was to read their son a bedtime story. It was about showing up. Vivienne had spent 35 years being too afraid to show up to her own life, and then she'd met a vampire who'd waited 3 hours believing she'd come, who'd never given up on her even when she'd given up on herself. And now she showed up every day, choosing him and their life together over fear. It was the best decision she'd ever made. And as they lay in bed that night, Percival's cool hand in hers, their son sleeping down the hall, 200 years of shared history behind them and countless more ahead, Vivienne thought about that empty chair in the restaurant, about all the moments that had led her here, about every fear she'd overcome and every risk she'd taken. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Percival whispered back. Thank you for coming back, for choosing hope. Thank you for waiting. And they fell asleep tangled together, two vampires who'd found each other across centuries and chose each other every single day, building a life that was extraordinary in its beautiful, ordinary moments. The story that started with an empty chair and a man who waited 3 hours had become a love that would last forever, and that was the most magical thing of all.